All right, welcome back everyone to Self Principle. As you know, Self Principle stands for Sleep, Exercise, Love, and Food. This is the nonprofit organization that I run where I try to go out into communities and try to do this work absolutely pro bono to teach about health, nutrition, fitness, and try to help people as much as possible, completely unrelated to my other work that I do professionally. So with that, we are live every Wednesday, 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Pacific Central Time. If you find this useful, I would appreciate it if you share it with your friends. The goal here is to always present you the latest research that's coming out so that you can make informed decisions and look for yourself. Now, today's topic is a very interesting one, at least for me, and that is specifically talking about weight loss versus looking at things like exercise. And the ultimate question that we're going to be talking about today is what's really better? Is it weight loss or is it exercise when it comes to things like overall health or even thinking about living longer, things like longevity? So it's going to be a very interesting topic because some of the information that I was able to come across actually surprised me very much so. So let's talk about some of the latest information and the latest research that's out there. And then you guys can decide for yourself whether or not this is something that makes sense to you and you want to try to incorporate it in your day-to-day activities. So a couple of things first right off the bat is when we start to talk about things like excess weight in this country, we're talking about the United States specifically. What's interesting about all of these conversations is despite the fact we've had so many amazing diets, we've had all sorts of weight loss medications come about, and there's more and more people out there talking about how to lose weight. Here's a trick. You can do this or you can do that. What's fascinating is even since 1980, for example, the rates of obesity have actually doubled in more than 70 countries. Once again, the crazy part is the rates of obesity have doubled in more than 70 countries. And when you start to look at in the United States alone, if you look at around 2000, the year 2000, we were looking at about a third of the population. We go back just a few years ago to 2018, we've gone from 30% to 42.4%. And why should we care? Because if you think about the trajectory on which way we're headed in the United States, we're going to end up easily doubling the rate of obesity by 2030. And so that means we'll be hitting closer to about 50 to 60% of the population that's classified as having obesity. Now, the reason this matters is because people in general have been trying to diet as long as we know. In fact, if you look at the number of people that are trying to lose weight, that number has gone up from about 34% back in 2000 to about 42% in 2015, 2016. And in fact, what's interesting is there was an NHANES survey, and what they talked about was that almost 50% of the adults in the United States had tried to lose weight in the past 12 months. So if you're listening to this, think about how many people have actually tried to lose weight over the last year, including yourselves. And the question is, what has been the thing that has prevented you from being successful? So this is where it becomes really interesting. There's this sort of weight loss cycle, and it's basically a futility cycle in that people want to lose weight, they try weight loss diets, and when they're not hitting their goal, they get stuck. They start to get frustrated. And they start to have, well, it's okay if I do this. This program is not working, so let me change. And then it leads to weight regain. And as you know, when you lose weight, you lose some muscle with it. But when you regain the weight, you're not putting the muscle back on. So this vicious cycle of losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight actually does so much damage because every time you slow down your metabolism and you're losing muscle and of course bone with it. And this leads to not just excess weight, but in the population itself, you're talking about increasing rates of obesity around the country. And the end result of this is that there has been so much focus on weight loss. In fact, when you look at the new weight loss drugs, which I've talked about several times, the challenge there is that people are looking at weight loss as a way to get healthy. And that may or may not be the case, because that's the question of today is, should weight loss be the primary goal of trying to get healthy? So there are lots of studies that have been published that go into things like comparing the idea of weight loss, and there are different studies that look at things like physical activity or something called cardiorespiratory fitness. And the question becomes, which one of these two is better? Now, there's no head to head trials, but there is this concept of fat but fit. That's a term that's used in social media, but the concept there is you can have some extra weight, but depending on how your cardiorespiratory fitness is, how your physical activity is, you may actually have a very low risk of anything bad happening. So, this is the problem that we talk about when we look at BMI or body mass index. When we talk about body mass index, we say things like if you have a BMI between 18.5 to 25, you are considered healthy. You have the lowest risk of dying from any causes, heart disease, cancer, etc. That's what the conventional thinking is. But here's the problem with conventional thinking. When we start to think about conventional thinking, the challenge that we start to run into is if we start to look at some of the meta analyses, what we see in those meta analyses is a few things. For example, we find that there's a study in JAMA that was published out in 2013. And what they found there was that if you have a BMI of 25 to 30, you actually had a lower risk of having any adverse outcome. And in fact, your risk was lower than if you had a BMI 18 to 25. Once again, if you had a BMI of a little higher, meaning 25 to 30, your risk was lower. So, what does that mean? It means that BMI may actually not be the best measure of seeing how we can make things better for ourselves. And so, this is why today's topic becomes so darn important to talk about. So, let's go into some of the very interesting data that's out there in terms of what's happening. So, first thing is this, let's talk about cardiorespiratory fitness. What's interesting about cardiorespiratory fitness is the idea that when you talk about studies that include this marker, what they find is that despite the fact that patients have a higher BMI, the risk of having adverse outcomes, heart attack, stroke, it all goes down simply because their cardiorespiratory fitness is better. Once again, even though their BMIs are high, there's a number of studies. How many? Tons. And I'll give a whole lot of links here. But for example, Berry et al., Progress Cardiovascular Diseases 2014. Berry et al. Another study in 2018. And what they were showing was all-cause mortality of people who were overweight versus people who were quote unquote in the healthy BMI. What was fascinating was that if you were unfit, meaning you had low cardiovascular fitness, if you were unfit, you had a 2.5 times higher risk of all cause mortality, your risk of dying from any disease, regardless of your BMI. Even if your BMI was lower, but physically you're unfit, your risk of a bad outcome was substantially higher. If we switch that around and we look at people who were overweight, who were considered to be obese, but they had high cardiovascular fitness, they actually had a lower death rate than adults who had a normal weight but were considered unfit. So these studies by Berry and colleagues, both in 2014, 2018, what's fascinating is that exercise and being physically fit it plays such a massive role in terms of the overall outcome. Let's go into muscle. What's fascinating about muscular fitness or having lean body mass is that if you have muscle and you have strength, in studies that look at things like hand grip as a marker for strength, I do jujitsu and you can tell by my finger this one's broken right now and it's been broken for a while. So I tape it up. But jujitsu is all about grip strength. But grip strength, hand grip strength, and even testing knee extension strength, all of those, the stronger you are, the less likely your risk of dying from any type of disease. And so it's fascinating that studies that came out in 2018, Garcia and colleagues, Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. There's Seidefard and colleagues in the European Journal of Prevention Cardiology, 2019. All of them show that the more muscular strength you have, the more respiratory fitness you have, the better off you are, irrespective of the weight. So then the next question comes up is, well, okay, so I get that. But what about if I'm just trying to lose weight? What's interesting about it is if you are somebody who is essentially healthy and you have intentional weight loss, some of the studies show that with intentional, so you're trying to lose weight, your risk of dying actually goes up, not down. Why? Because when people are losing weight, just weight, and not focusing on cardio and strength training, what's happening to them is very important that muscle is the one thing that is absolutely linked to how well you do in health and how long you live. If you just lose weight and you lose muscle with it, your risk of dying is unfortunately going to go up. This is why one of the greatest things that you can do for yourself is to make sure you sort of stop tuning into social media and looking at all these gurus talking about the idea that they have some magical weight loss thing, and instead focus on the idea that health is about movement, it's about resistance training. And yes, if you lose some weight with it, that's great, but don't focus on it. Now, some of the people are so concerned about weight that they'll go and do things like liposuction. So, how does liposuction affect your overall health? Well, if you remove fat, you're removing essentially the fat that's in front and what we call subcutaneous fat or under the skin. If you remove that, the data shows that it does not improve any of the cardiovascular markers. And so there are studies by Boriani and colleagues, Danila and colleagues. The first one was 2014, the second one is 2013, Saretis and colleagues, 2015. All of them show that your cardiovascular disease risk profile did not change. And what's important is the fat that we call the visceral or around the organs, the more important fat, that's the one that liposuction does not change. But what's interesting and so scary about liposuction is that when you take out the subcutaneous fat, you think you did yourself good, but the visceral fat in those patients actually increases. And the only time in studies they saw that it didn't increase was in people who were actively doing strength and cardiovascular training. This is from Benatti and colleagues in 2012. Now, what about bariatric surgery? We talk about bariatric surgery. As you know, I'm an obesity medicine specialist and a kidney doctor, so I do both things. And so we have lots of patients that go through bariatric surgery. The question becomes on bariatric surgery is we know that there's a lot of data that shows that your risk of dying from both major causes and microvascular diseases gets better. Even things like you can go into remission. We don't use the word cure. We say your diabetes has gone to sleep. But you can go into remission by doing bariatric surgery. So the question becomes there is with bariatric surgery, is that overall effective? Well, here's what's interesting. You're going to lose a lot of weight. But did you know that within days after surgery, your blood sugars, the amount of insulin resistance you have, they rapidly improve. This is long before you start to get that significant weight loss. So, how is that? Is it the weight loss from bariatric surgery that's making it better or something else? Because your blood sugars are already getting better. So the reason this matters is that even in bariatric surgery patients, when we look at their BMI, what happens is how much your BMI is going down is not a good predictor of whether or not you're going to put the weight back on and relapse, you're going to become a diabetic again. None of those are actually correlated. In fact, people who end up becoming diabetics again, what's interesting is they had similar weight loss to people who didn't become diabetics again. What makes a difference? There are two meta-analyses that show physical activity increased significantly in patients after bariatric surgery, and those patients who increased their physical activity were least likely to go back into those disease states. So, one more time, if you were somebody who got bariatric surgery done, but you exercise, and exercise was the single most effective way to prevent you from going back and putting the weight back on. Now, what is it about exercise and cardiorespiratory fitness in terms of mortality risk overall? So, when we start to talk about this stuff, there are so many different studies. In fact, the papers that I was looking at, and there's, gosh, about 15 papers here in terms of how increasing physical activity, both making sure that you're doing cardio and strength training, was associated with the reduction of the risk of death. How much? Just increasing physical activity led to a 15% to 50% reduction in the risk of dying from all causes. And specifically for heart events, there was a 15 to 40% reduction. One more time, 15 to 40% reduction simply by moving more and adding resistance training. This was irregardless of whether they lost weight or didn't lose weight. And when you start to get into categories of unfit, somebody who's basically sitting all day versus somebody who is fit, what happens is the difference in rates of death ends up being 30 to 60%. One more time, the rates of death, the difference between the two groups is massive, 30 to 60% in terms of the people who are fit versus the people who are unfit. And if you were to be somebody who's unfit and you said, look, let me just start moving a little bit every day. Even if you did that, what they found was that as you went from unfit to lower fitness to just being fit, you had about a 50% reduction in your risk of heart death, 60% reduction in death from strokes. How powerful is that? That this is not medication, this is simply moving more and just trying to push or pull things that are a little bit heavy. Now, when we start to get into this idea of cardiorespiratory fitness, you know you're going to lose some weight if you start to do exercise. So the question is it all because you lost the weight with exercise versus you lost the weight without exercise? Does it matter which one it is? So let's take a look. There's the Aerobic Center Longitudinal Study, or ACLS, and what they were finding was, once again, even if you did not lose any weight with exercise, if you didn't lose any weight with exercise, but you exercised, your risk of death from any cause went down substantially. There's another study. This is the Oslo Ischemia study from 2019. And they looked at men who started at low cardiorespiratory fitness. And what they saw was that in terms of their changes in their weight, when they looked at people who were unfit and they compared them to those who increased their fitness, what they saw was even though their weights were exactly identical, the people who improved their fitness had a 34% reduction in risk of dying from anything, 60% reduction in the risk of stroke. The other study that was really interesting, this was a large United Kingdom cohort, and they looked at increasing physical activity over 10 years. They also saw just little bits of movements reduce your risk of death by 22% and heart disease, so dying from a heart attack or stroke, by as much as 24%. Now, what is the problem with all of us because we are so focused on losing weight? All of this talk about the new weight loss drugs, the GLP-1s with names like Ozempic and Wegovy, and the new GLP-GIP such as Mounjaro and Tirzepatide, meaning Mounjaro and Zepbound are the brand names, and people thinking if we just take that and we lose weight, we're going to do great. The answer is that's not the case. In fact, I started today's talk talking about the fact that there's this yo-yo. And the problem with this yo-yo is every time you lose weight, you lose muscle with it. Then you lose focus, you gain the weight back, but you don't put the muscle back on. So essentially, you are replacing your muscle over time with more and more and more fat. And what you're not focusing on is the idea of exercise. So weight cycling, unfortunately, is very bad for us. In fact, weight cycling of losing weight, gaining weight, losing weight, gaining weight is associated with a 41% higher risk of dying from anything, a 36% higher risk of dying specifically from heart causes. And that's why it matters. In fact, weight cycling is also associated with a 35% higher risk of high blood pressure. So, as you're thinking about this, and we did a whole talk on high blood pressure last week in terms of all of the things you can do, but it turns out that this weight cycling concept absolutely messes up your blood pressure. Now, when we talk about blood pressure, and if you tuned into last week's live stream, we talked about how just exercising or weight loss can cause you to have improvements in your blood pressure. So, what's the data? So, there are studies published in 2005 by Cornelissen and Fagard, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. They did another study in 2013. There was a study by Ashton and colleagues in 2020 looking at resistance training. They looked at aerobic training, and here's what they found. Doing exercise, movement, what they found was your blood pressure went down by 2 to 5 points. But here's the thing. If you did weight loss, your blood pressure went down by about 1 to 5 points. So what's the bottom line? If you exercise, resistance and cardiovascular, you get exactly the same results as if you're doing weight loss. The difference is you have so many secondary benefits happening from exercise that you want to really think about this. Even when we talk about blood sugars, the improvements with exercise on hemoglobin A1C was roughly around, zero point 0.2 to about 0.9. This is Franz and colleagues in 2015 and Zomer and colleagues in 2016. When they looked at exercise had about 0.2 to 0.8 improvement in A1C. In other words, improvements in blood sugars as measured by hemoglobin A1C were similar between weight loss and just getting up and moving. So when you're thinking about this, don't get obsessed. Don't get stuck on the idea that if I'm not losing weight, I'm not getting healthy. That couldn't be further from the truth. The idea here is meeting you where you're at. When we start to think about lipids, everybody talks about cholesterol and they fight all day long. Do this diet and your cholesterol is amazing. It turns out if you just start to do exercise, you can lower your LDL, which is considered to be the bad cholesterol. You can raise your HDL. So HDL goes up by about 2 to 5 points. That's based on the study by Kodama and colleagues, 2007. The next one, I can't say the name correctly, is WEWEGE, Viveji and colleagues, 2018. Igarashi and colleagues, 2019, Lin and colleagues, 2015, and turns out that that improvement in your HDL is so fascinating because if you lost a bunch of weight, you would improve your HDL by about 1 to 4 points. Exercise was about 2 to 5 points. So once again, about the same. Exercise or weight loss improved your lipids. Same thing with LDL. LDL was about 3 to 10 points with exercise going down, or 1 to 15 points with weight loss going down. Triglycerides, same concept. It went down 5 to 25 points simply by exercising, or 11 to 50 points by weight loss. What about your blood vessels? As we go through high blood pressure, they harden. Well, it turns out exercise improves what we call flow, how well the blood is flowing, flow mediated dilation or enlarging of the blood vessels, which is a good thing. And so what they saw was with weight loss, about 8.5, 8.6 kilos, there was about a 3% improvement. When they looked at exercise training, they saw that it was between 1 to 4%. In other words, same range. No statistical difference that we see between the two numbers. But here's the part that you want to know that's really, really interesting. And at least for guys like me, it's really cool, which is ectopic fat versus, talking about subcutaneous, the fat nobody likes, but it's not really that bad. What's right under the skin versus the visceral fat. So visceral fat, especially in the liver, is really, really dangerous. And we know that we want to improve that. So here's where it becomes interesting. With weight loss, visceral fat doesn't go down as much, but if you add exercise to it, exercise can cause substantial improvements in visceral fat, especially in fatty liver. So combining the two becomes really interesting. And this is why it's so exciting. So when we talk about visceral fat, one of the studies out there was in Obesity Review in 2016. They showed that 5% weight loss with exercise training resulted in 21% reduction in visceral fat. Once again, if you lost weight just by exercising, 21% reduction in visceral adiposity or visceral fat. But if you did the same 5% weight loss with just cutting calories, you only got a 13% reduction. What's the point? More bang for your buck with exercise. And so, as you're thinking about this, what's the bottom line of today? It's very simple. The bottom line, and I know somebody put that in the chat already, is that go exercise more. Yes, but it's more important to listen and understand the why. The what is easy, go do this. But if the what was all you needed to know, everybody would have done it. When you understand the details, when you truly understand why it's important, you're more likely to stick to it. So, bottom line, stop thinking just about weight loss. People do all sorts of crazy things. They're like, okay, if I only eat one meal a day, I'm going to be great. And, because I'm eating so little calories, I'm going to lose all this weight. That's great. But my goal for you is not to have you be the best looking person in the coffin, is to be the best version of yourself who's alive and hopefully who can go out and change the world for the better. So as you think about where you're at, first, I know there's a lot of fat shaming and we want to move away from that. Second, realize that a weight centric approach only to people with excess weight is terrible. Instead, we want to focus on a health centric approach, which starts with movement and resistance training and then adds on calorie reduction. Not calorie reduction and forget about everything. If you're trying and struggling to lose weight, it's okay. But don't go cycling. Don't lose weight, give it up, try it again. Start to emphasize exercise. Do resistance training 3 times a week. Move every single day. That's it. You don't need to join a gym. You can make your gym yourself by parking as far away as you can at the parking lot. Every little detail counts, but don't beat yourself up so much about this. If you want to gain weight, if you want to gain muscle, you got to push your body, which means you got to do resistance training. That's the only way. Whether you get some resistance bands, you get a couple of dumbbells, you go on YouTube and watch a video, or if you're able to afford things like Peloton and all these other apps that help you in terms of those workouts, do it. I do kettlebell workouts with my daughters. I think it's the best thing ever. It's not for everybody. And then I do the Peloton app for mobility training simply because as I get older, I know my flexibility is going down. Let me go to the chat and answer a couple of questions. I know this was longer, but once again, my goal is not to tell you go move more. Everybody can tell you that. My goal is to make you understand why it's important to you so you'll actually stick to it. So, in terms of questions over here, Vincent said he was fighting two things and the government of which we're about to lose. I get it. Um, but thank you so much for joining. And a few people, let's see, CJ said, thank you so much. Thank you, CJ, for your support. Chris said, thank you, mate. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. Barbara said, thank you so much. This is one of the best talks about this. Thank you, Barbara, for the support. Din is from Toronto, Canada. Welcome back, Din. Thank you so much. Kids are great. They're actually in wrestling practice. I'm going to go after this. Got jiu-jitsu today, trying to heal my finger, but I'm still on it. Listen, at the end of the day, the only message I have for you is progress over perfection. That's it. Don't worry about if you are the best in everything. All I know is I'm not. You know, I'm 49, I go to jiu-jitsu, and I have 18-year-old kids and 15-year-old kids who beat me up like crazy. And the question is, my wife always says, why do you keep going? I know because if I don't go, I'm more likely to stop and start to get sedentary. When I go, I feel better. Even though I got beaten up, I still go and I feel better. So, my moral message to you is very simple: do good for others, do good for yourself. If you fall down, the most important thing that happens is what do you do after you fall down? And as always, I always end with kindness, and my message is the same. When you grow up, you have all these dreams, hopes of what you're going to do. If you can be anything, why not be kind? So please spread the kindness to each other. You know, it's funny, there's all sorts of comments that come on YouTube. And what I always say to people is at the end of your life, nobody's going to care how smart you are. They're going to care how you made them feel. So I would rather be wrong, but help you to feel good about yourself than be right and have you leave here feeling bad about yourself. So, with that, thank you very much for your time. I'm so grateful you decided to spend this afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and taking this time to join us. We will see you back next Wednesday, 5 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Pacific Central Time. As always, if you enjoyed this or you like this, please let your friends know about this. With that, thank you very much.